next one will sort of take place during the background to the Blitzkrieg in France. So, and then there are, I think, 4 more novels after that lined up. So it's going to run for a bit.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's as I say, I finished it today, and it's really gripping. And I was really interested in you sort of answered one of my questions about the fact that it didn't sort of start off to be a series. And I guess as you've got to know him as a character, and as you've gone on through, you've become more acquainted with him, and I guess, you know, as you've done your research, which is very detailed, and we'll come on to that in a second. More possibilities have arisen for him.
Yes, I mean, you know, he's a character that's kind of growing on me, and really he's a test bed for that question that we should all ask ourselves when we think about Nazi Germany is, you know, if I'd been there, would I have behaved any differently? Would I have done something?
Yeah.
And we all like to think that we would, but the reality is, I think there was a nice little thought experiment somebody came up with. They said, look, you know, and they were at some literary festival. They said, look, if the doors were just closed on us now by some terrorists, and we were starved for and given no water for 4 or 5 days, and then on the 5th day they lobbed in 5 bottles of water, what do you think would happen? Would you hand that water out to those most in need? Would you share it out equally? Would you try and get it for yourself? And of course, you know, probably all those things would happen amongst those people who are in that room. So the idea that we would somehow be morally superior, you know, really doesn't last the test, the practical test. And what I want to do with Schenke is, you know, he's a guy that's trying to fight for justice and the rule of law in what is essentially a gangster regime, and you know, he's going to be tested all the way down the line. And sometimes he may. I mean, this is the beauty when you write a series, the characters develop a life of their own. Sometimes I think he's going to surprise me and do something I'm not terribly approving of.
Because he's a very conflicted character, isn't he? I really liked him. I thought that he's conflicted because he doesn't really believe in, you know, what he should believe in as part of, you know, the SS, and that he plays lip service to it, and he knows that he shouldn't. He knows that he should be more sort of involved, but he doesn't want to be. And it must have been really difficult to live in that sort of environment where you don't really believe in what's going on, but you have to toe the line, really, because otherwise you end up, well, at worst case scenario, dead. Best case scenario, you're never going to be sort of, you know, you're going to be sort of hunted down, or, you know, and in his case, he knows that what he has to do to survive, really.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, it's a very gradual process. At the moment I'm reading this book, The Nazi Mind.
Oh, right, yeah.
Yeah, which it's an interesting book. I mean, I wouldn't say there are 1 or 2 problems with some of the kind of cod psychology that's thrown in, but what it does sort of bring across quite clearly is the incremental nature in which people move from moral positions to sort of espousing or tolerating the kind of regime that the Nazis were operating. And you know, as far as the police are concerned, it's a different sort of situation, because Kripo, the criminal investigation, and the Gestapo were the kind of the elite of the German police forces. The Gestapo wasn't a Nazi invention; it was a Prussian invention. And you know, the Nazis under Himmler, basically, they tried to draw all the policing activities and all the police intelligence activities into the SS. So these people like Schenke and the criminal Polizei saw themselves as the elite of the German police force, and you know, they saw these Hugo Boss uniformed SS types as interlopers, as dilettantes. So when they were, you know, offered, you know, they were kind of gently at first, encouraged to become party members and to accept SS rank. You know, they didn't want to see themselves as slumming it with these people, you know, because they were only pretend police in their eyes. Of course, that, you know, gradually changed as people realised that, you know, if they wanted to build their careers, then they had to go along with this. A lot of them held out. Even the guy who ran the Gestapo, Heinrich Müller, didn't join the Nazi Party until 1940, when he was ordered to do so by Himmler. Up until then, he just was a careerist police officer taking advantage of the situation, but he didn't want to be a Nazi Party member. So he resisted it for as long as possible. And surprisingly, by the end of the war, quite a lot of senior police officers were still not members of the party and were still not members of the SS. They stuck it out to the end.
Well, he's like that. Like he gets invited, doesn't he, to a party which has sort of very high-profile guests, I think we can say without giving any spoilers. And he really doesn't want to go, does he? But he knows that he's got to go, because if he doesn't, he's going to be sort of highlighted that he's not sort of, towing the line. And but that, it was very. I was sort of quite surprised with the sort of. I mean, not surprised, because I don't think that's the right word, but just like the level of sort of the, how they were very much the officers' wives, and, they were very much about sort of status and, getting these people, because he was Schenke's a imposed retired racing driver, isn't he? So yeah. He's quite glamorous. He comes from a background of wealth. He's quite wealthy in his own right, but he doesn't really want to play on that sort of aristocratic background. And they would love him to join, because he's got all those sort of the qualities that they see as wanting, isn't it?
Yeah, it's quite the social cachet, isn't it?
Yeah,
he has, and nothing could be much more glamorous than being an former racing driver of the Silver Arrows Mercedes racing team. Yeah, so he's one of those. I mean, that's kind of how that type of celebrity, I think, tends to endure. I mean, we see it today in celebrity culture today. God knows how long Katie Price is going to be a celebrity, but she seems to be managing to spin that one out for some decades. So, it's the same with Schenke. He's a guy that less than 10 years earlier was, at the top of the tree in terms of motor racing. So he has his accident, which is that, I mean, I didn't do it particularly for that reason. I just needed something that would keep him in Germany and in Berlin and in the police force when everybody else was being conscripted and sent to fight in the East and so on. So he needed some kind of disabling injury in order to keep him there. But then it all sort of, the logic of that sort of followed through, and when he eventually encounters Hitler, who is a motor racing nut, like Mussolini was, both these guys were very much into their cars. So of course. Hitler comes over as all fanboy when he meets.
Yeah, oh, that's funny. Did you sort of, with the inspiration, because obviously you've written, lots of other historical series in very different, sort of the Romans, you've got very, very different. Was it quite, was that the research? Was it sort of that sort of point where you said about Alderney? Was it then that inspiration sort of came for this series, or was there something else that sort of triggered that wanting to write about World War II?
I mean, I had written a book about the Second World War before called Hearts of Stone, which is about the Greek resistance in the Aegean, not Aegean, I can't remember which side they're on the seas, but yeah, around Lefkas and Catalonia and so on. So I'd written this book, and I think some of the characters that may well turn up in the series, because I always quite like that kind of crossover thing that happens occasionally. But the thing is, it's not a particular historical period that interests me. It's history in general. I mean, that's where all the interesting stories are. That's where the interesting teaching moments occur. And one of the reasons why I loved teaching history when I was teaching history, and I loved learning about it when I was a student at school. And I just hope also that you kind of encourage people to be interested in history, because we need to know about it. It's one of those things Definitely. That I mean, I had many years ago. I had a lunch with Paddy Ashdown, and we were talking about Afghanistan, and he was going on about what a great success it was this time, and we were making great strides. And I said, how many times have the British been in Afghanistan and kicked out? 3 times. What makes it so different this time? And there's this kind of, weird assumption among some people that, because the technology is slightly different, it's going to be different this time round. And it wasn't the last 3 times round. So you wonder at the capacity of very intelligent people sometimes, not to learn from history. And I think that's quite a dangerous thing.
It's quite terrifying as well, isn't it? I think, especially at the moment, it feels very much more real than has done for a long time for me, as I think it feels much more threatening than it has done for a long time. And
it's crazy, isn't it? I mean, we're sitting here on with the stuff that's going on in Ukraine and Putin and so on, and it's almost as like appeasement never happened last time round. That if you give these people everything they claim, that somehow they'll go away and be happy about it, and you know damn well that Putin won't. So what is wrong with the likes of these people in America who are sort of playing the appeasers game and hoping that they'll get a different result? It's madness.
I was reading, Sophie sent me through one of your articles that I was reading just before I came on, which was about how the Nazi regime basically pardoned loads of people at the beginning of their so that a lot of criminals. They basically, and I thought that was really interesting, that because certain people have pardoned people as well, not criminals, but.
Well, no, I mean, they are criminals. They're exactly the same kind of people. They were violent thugs, murderers, and all sorts of bad eggs. That Hitler pardoned 8,000 of them as soon as he came to power, and then the next thing he did was open 56 days later Dachau to put those people he didn't, whose faces he didn't like. It took Trump 7 days to reopen Guantanamo. Trump's already working his way through firing all the senior military officers who won't sort of subscribe to his worldview, and now he's turning on the courts, and he's basically ignoring what happens in the courts. All of this is out of the playbook from 1933. So we are sort of witnessing this kind of echoes. If you really want to sort of downplay it, it's substantially worse than that. I think we're in for a very, very difficult time. And I think, it's just that easy to subvert a democracy. If you have the kind of clout and the determination to see it through, you use the institutions of the democracy that you inherited to dismantle it. And this is what Trump's doing, and it's also what Adolf did back in the day. However, somebody picked me up on this. Oh, you're saying that, Hitler and Trump are the same. I said, absolutely not. Hitler was far better read and far more intelligent. I mean, that's the big difference.
Right. Well, moving on. The bit that one of the parts of the story that I really found fascinating was not only the gang culture of that period, but the sort of the clubs, and the Ace of Heart clubs is very sort of prominent and partial. I can't get my words out. Very much part of the story, and that's where the sort of beginnings of this book happens. Is there's a fire after things happen. I don't want to give too much away, so it's difficult. Was that sort of based on a real place, and how did that sort of come about in this story?
Well, one of the things, there was a sort of high degree of criminality in Germany after the First World War, and a lot of guns on the streets as well, because there were revolutions, counter-revolutions, and gangs of the Freikorps and people like that wandering around, knocking on the head anybody that disagreed with them. So you had a lot of that going on. Then the criminal underworld was rife. I mean, there were these things called the Ringverein, who are the criminal gangs, which basically have an identity of the ring on their finger. And it was a support service for a lot of these guys in prison. So if they were caught by the cops and sent down, then their families would be supported, and when they came out, they would be found a place in the organization, and so it would go. And you had to be loyal to the gang and the gang leader. Absolutely. So these are very, standard criminal gangs in that respect. And when the Nazis came to power, of course, everybody makes this assumption: oh yes, they were totalitarian and they got rid of all the gangs and crime and cracked down on that. And they didn't. A lot of these gangsters had to be proved to them, to be very useful to them during their earlier political period, when they would, would sort of subcontract them to do violence to communists and so on, and that's how that worked. And when the Nazis came to power, they also discovered that the clubs and some of the services provided by these gangs were a useful safety valve. So people could go to clubs and sort of let off some steam, talk in a slightly more unguarded way about the regime, and that was kind of tolerated, because otherwise, that sort of tension builds up. If it doesn't have any outlet, and counter-revolutions and plotters, conspiracies, and this sort of thing can happen. So you have that on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Nazis were very, very keen on their black market goods, and of course, rationing didn't begin when the war started. Rationing had happened earlier, because the Germans were keen to build up their armaments industry, so they didn't want foreign currency or any currency, hard currency, leaving the country. So they imposed rationing years before the Second World War. So that meant that a lot of the luxuries that the Nazi Party had gotten themselves used to were in short supply. So they were quite happy to tolerate gangs and black markets and so on, and nightclubs, at least until 1943, and then finally, that's when Goebbels does the Sports Palace Total War speech, and that's when they really seriously finally kind of crack down on organized crime in the black market. But up until then, they're quite happy to tolerate it.
So the main sort of point of this book is the sort of that Schenke is trying to crack the forgery of ration tokens, isn't he? That's where the sort of story sort of comes from. And was that something that went, because obviously your research is very, very detailed, and I know that you're a real stickler for making sure that the historical fact is in the book is absolutely spot on. Was that something that came up when you were researching, or was that purely sort of your own sort of
this is the thing, when you're doing the research, you may be researching for a particular story, and of course in the course of the research you probably generate about 8 other plots, and one of which I came across references to forging ration coupons and so on. I thought, well, okay, I'm sort of interested in it, and I wasn't quite sure what to do about it, so I introduced it in the first book, and then it's referenced in the second book, and then only in the third book now are they actually dealing with it, because things come to a head with the murder of one of the gang bosses. So, and so I think there'll be that, because that's what police work is like. There is this constant overlap of cases. Yeah. So maybe, the main story of the novel may be this, but the same police officer is dealing with about 2 or 3 other things at the same time, at least. So I think that will be something that becomes a feature of the series, really, is that there are certain things that will carry over. Even though the main narrative of each book will be self-contained, there will be certain aspects of certain investigations that may well carry over, and certainly certain issues. Yeah.
I think there's. Can we talk a little bit about your research, because again, there's some really sort of. I imagine some of it was quite harrowing, quite difficult to read, and also sort of surprising as well. I imagine there were things that you sort of that are hidden from history.
Yeah, I mean, it's different from anything else that I've researched, insofar as all the research I do for the Schenke books and so on, I come away from it feeling very soiled, if I'm honest, because there's nothing redeeming about the Third Reich. Absolutely nothing. No. I was reading a book last year called Culture in the Third Reich, and it's a really big old book, and dealing with theatre, sculpture, literature, art, music, cinema, and so on. And there's not one of these things that isn't kind of ruthlessly suppressed and forced into basically an arm of the propaganda ministry. And you're just thinking, oh my word, it's not the culture, it's the cruelty to Jewish people, it's the sort of manipulation of young minds, it's the, it goes on and on and on and on. So it's a bit depressing, but it has to be done. I mean, and of course, you can't help but notice certain parallels in history as well, which are equally depressing to read about. The other part of it is travel. I mean, I think it's important to go to where a book is set, because you need to get a sense of the atmosphere there, and when literally the atmosphere, because places do smell different, and you get a sense of the dampness in the air or the heat in the air if you're writing about the Middle East or something. And for example, when I went to Jordan a couple of times, there's you're standing on top of the Wadi Araba and there's no humidity, so you can see pin sharp, for 10, 15 miles. And of course, when you go to Germany in the middle of the winter and spring, and there's a lot of foggy mistiness about, and there's a kind of grey, a constant greyness. Although sometimes, I mean, it's weird. I always seem to go to research these places. I'm hoping they're going to be grey and misty, and they turn out to be blazing sunshine. And the last 2 trips. So,
which is yeah. I guess that sort of you want that sort of that sort of. When I was reading it, I imagined it to be misty and murky, not like glorious blue sky and sunshine. You sort of imagine it. I don't know whether that's sort of the grubby undertones of it. It sort of makes you sort of feel that it should be like that.
Well, I think the other thing you have to bear in mind, of course, is that this is before legislation on smog and stuff, so that in cities there would be that kind of sooty haze, even on a good day, and you'd be very lucky if you got a blue sky in Berlin. So yeah, there's a lot you can pick up, and wandering around Berlin, it's a fabulous city, and it's my favourite European city, if not my favourite city in the world. There's a lovely chilled atmosphere everywhere, but they take their attitude to history very, very seriously. It's not like the UK, where we have, I believe the expression is flag-shagging nationalists, who are constantly going on about how we mustn't sort of challenge our history and it's glorious and we need to be terribly proud of it and so on. In Germany, they see history as something you learn from, the good and the bad. And if you go to their museums, they don't shy away from that. They have galleries filled with what happened during the Nazi era. There's even a museum, I think it's called the Topography of Terror, which was constructed on the ruins of the old Gestapo headquarters. And that's pretty sobering, eye-opening stuff. But I don't suppose I would ever see a museum like that in the UK, on slavery.
No.
So it's healthy to sort of see history in that light. And then, of course, you have you turn a corner of a street in Berlin, and you will see the entire facade of these older buildings still covered with shell damage and bullet damage from the Russian assault at the end of the war. So it's a city that wears its history pretty heavily.
Yeah, that's really interesting, isn't it? Because like you say, I mean, obviously we've got, cities that have been, and I live in Devon, so, Exeter, there's parts of Exeter, I'm thinking of like places like Liverpool, which were were bombed, and, there's still sort of, you can't see what happened, but you can see that there were, is basically thousands of flats and new, and you occasionally get like one little terrace house, a little place in Liverpool where there's like one house where literally there's everything else was bombed around it and it's just one little place standing. But it is interesting how I was really fascinated with that sort of how they sort of don't shy away from that, because we do, don't we, very much as a
we do, sadly, and I think that's in large part down to our rather monolithic media, which tends to represent things in the most patriotic terms possible, even at the expense of facts. Whereas I think there is there's more divergency, of this sort of thing. Plus, as I said, an appreciation in Germany that you do need to have a far more honest and diverse understanding of history than is the case that we have in the UK.
Yeah. I've sort of really found we talked about the sort of the atmosphere, and how did you sort of recreate that? Because obviously you went to Germany, but you couldn't go back to 1940s Germany. So was that again through your research that you sort of were able to set that scene, because you did very well?
Yeah, you get a lot of from research, but also there's some quite good films that are a big help in this sort of thing. I don't know if you've ever seen Fritz Lang's M. That kind of gives you a very nice depiction of what workers' apartment blocks in Germany in 1930 were like. So you can kind of pull all this together and then use your imagination to sort of fill out the gaps, really, and to paint the scene. Because that's how it kind of feels when you're writing. You after about 20 minutes or so sitting in front of the word processor, you do begin to, I think Stephen King has this lovely phrase, see through the page. And what he means by that is, of course, you begin to almost hear, almost see, almost smell the surroundings that you're writing about. And then it's like a cinema playing out in your head, and you're just describing what your senses are picking up and putting it down. And of course, the other side of that is, because one thing you have to remind readers about is they do 50% of the work. I put black marks down on white paper, as best as I can to create that. And then, of course, for every reader, this is the beauty of writing, of course, is that they create a unique experience in their head in a way that going to see a film can never do, because it's just the director's vision that you're seeing. Whereas, when we read a book, it's a very personal, very creative act reading. And what you get out of it, I think that's why reading is so much more rewarding than going to see a film, particularly, if it's a film of a book and both.
Absolutely, yeah.
And that's why the screen version is always so unsatisfying.
Yeah, because I guess you could, like how many people will read your book, and to think that each one will get a different experience from reading that book as well is, although you've got the sort of the facts in there, what I think it also comes from your own sort of personal sort of point of view as well, and what you've experienced in your life, isn't it? You bring that to the story, because you might, none of us have been probably to 1940s Berlin, but there will be, like you say, you'll have seen films, you'll have seen, that will inform that sort of thought process.
Yeah. And that's, as I say, I think that's one of the, absolute amazing things about reading, is that it is that creative exercise. And it's funny, I mean, one of the big trends in recent years has been the development of Audible, which I'm a big fan of. I get paid more for an Audible book than I do for a print book, so why not? But it's, I tried a couple once, and I'm thinking that's not how I imagine that character to sound. You can get on with other stuff when you're listening to the book. That's very, very useful. But it still kind of imposes a level of interpretation on the text that wouldn't be the case if you were just reading it. And the other thing that we do, of course, is we read at different speeds. So if you sometimes, like I do, you'll be reading something and it may just draw you up, sharply, and you think, wow. For example, what was I reading the other day? It was the opening rereading Rosemary Sutcliffe's Eagle of the Ninth. And I'd just forgotten how good a writer she was when she's describing some guy driving a British chariot team on a summer's evening. And, I stopped. I thought, how did you do that? Because I was there. I was on that chariot. And, of course, you can do that if you're reading a novel as opposed to listening to it on Audible. And the other thing I do, of course, which I can't help but do, is write in the margins, and you can't do that on Audible.
Yeah. No, you can't do that in Audible. I mean, it's different. I mean, I used to work in a library, so so I think we've got a bit of a lag on our Wi-Fi at the moment.
Yeah, it's Facebook, I think, as you said.
Now, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we're lagging a bit. Sorry. So I was going to say, I can see the benefits of. I definitely see the benefits of audio books as well, but they are different. I know what you mean about sort of your sort of listening to someone tell the story, and sometimes I don't. I think the narrator is really important in those books, because if you get the wrong narrator, that can.
Yeah, I mean, if you get a good one, I mean, and I'm lucky with so far in most cases. There's a guy called Jonathan Keeble who seems to do most of my stuff, and I'm perfectly happy with him. I think he's doing a blinding job. But there was one book, Playing with Death, which was a crime novel, techno crime novel I wrote with one of my students some years ago, And the author said, the publisher said, here are some samples of people we want to read this. And there was one woman who sounded just like Catherine Hepburn, who I thought would be perfect, for the thing, because it needed that kind of slightly dry, ironic tone to it. And when the book came out, it was something completely different. It sounded like a sort of squeaky little media influencer. Kind of killed it a bit for me.
Yeah, I can imagine. It's I imagine it's a bit like, sort of, because have you sort of, do you know what Schenke looks like in your mind? Do you have a sort of, because I know some authors don't have any idea what their characters look like. Do you sort of have a picture of him in your head?
Yeah, I do. I mean, there's a German actor I quite liked, some from the 60s. I can't remember his name, but he had a sort of slightly sort of bold but slightly well, not sort of heavily chiseled, but lightly kind of chiseled sort of jaw.
Yeah.
And dark curly hair. Well, not curly, but wavy, and intense brown eyes. And I thought, that's kind of who I had, because that's what you do sometimes as kind of placeholders in your head when you're writing. You kind of envision somebody looking a particular way. So, for example, his sidekick Hauser. In my head, I was thinking of that guy Tench from Mindhunter television series. He has that kind of very heavy features with that kind of crew cut. So that's
So can we? I was really intrigued by the relationship that Ruth and Schenke have. So, Ruth is not his long-term girlfriend. I haven't read book 2, so can you give us a little bit of background on them?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things you have to understand is that after the Nuremberg laws, it became very, very dangerous to have relationships between Aryans and Jewish people in Germany. And I think anybody who, living then would have made absolutely certain that sort of thing didn't happen. And then, of course, in the first book, Ruth is basically a secondary character. And, whoops, host has left the broadcast. Host has joined. Are we back? Hello.
Hello. Sorry, we disappeared there for a minute.
Where did we get to?
Sorry. You were talking about. You said that Ruth was a secondary character, so maybe reverse a bit because they might have missed that bit.
Okay, so she's a secondary character, and in order to protect this witness, Schenke becomes slightly involved with her, and then because he's that kind of white knight character, he becomes very protective, and so the relationship kind of evolves through circumstance, not through any kind of romanticness that takes place.
No.
And Ruth, is the research, that was based that allowed me to base the character on Ruth. There are plenty of these accounts of Jewish people surviving in Berlin during the course of the war, and a number of those are accounts by women. And one thing that kind of struck me was just how ruthless they were, no pun intended, were prepared to be in order to survive the war, and the things that they were prepared to do in order to achieve that. And it's sort of unimaginable. This is one of the problems, and particularly when you come across characters like Stella Kubler, who was another woman who survived the war, and she was born with blonde hair and blue eyes, Jewish woman, and when they started picking on the Jewish people, she didn't sort of think, oh, bad Nazis. She just felt ashamed of being Jewish. So when the war started and they started cracking down on the Jews more thoroughly, she went underground, became, as these people called themselves, U-boats, because they were literally under the surface, living under the surface of Jewish society. And she was eventually caught by the Gestapo and tortured and turned. And they said to her, look, if you work for us, then we won't send your parents to the east to the camps and extermination. So they basically blackmailed her into working for them. And it turned out at the end of the war that they'd already sent them to the camps. They were already dead at the time they made this deal with her. And one of her friends from school, this guy who was a year below her who really fancied her, had wondered what had become of her. His family had managed to get out, and he joined the American army. And then after the war, tried to find out. And he was horrified that she had become this person who betrayed Jewish people in Berlin. But it goes back to that thing we were talking about earlier. What would we have done if we were in her situation? And she said to him, look, my parents, I was trying to survive and I was trying to save my parents. What choice did I have? And he said, well, other people chose differently. They chose not to, sort of. And she said, yes, and they died, So it's one of those things that it's as much a kind of test for characters like Ruth as it was for Stella. I mean, Ruth may go down the same route. I don't know. I mean, this is a series that kind of evolves in the telling. I have no plans for these things. I mean, Schenke might not even survive the war, actually. We'll have to see. So it'll work out on its own terms. But I think, that it comes back to that question every time. We think we do the right thing in the circumstances, but so few of us do. And so those that do sometimes, pay the ultimate price. And most people probably sort of oscillate between the two. So
I think that's the thing, isn't it, as well? It's like, what is the right thing? Is it the right thing for you and your family, or is it the right thing for the greater good as such? And I think probably most of us, if we would had to choose between our family and what was, I think, if it was me, like saying, right, you've got to save your kids or go and work, for the Nazis, I wouldn't want to make that decision. But, my kids are everything. So
exactly. And the thing is, people from the outside will look at that and call you a traitor. But as any parent will tell you, there's virtually nothing you wouldn't do for the good of your kids.
No. The sort of the gangs element of the book, I really enjoyed it. I did think of, and I think I saw it in one of your articles about that sort of Peaky Blinders but a bit more. Yeah, I mean, but that sort of, because of the almost like, although it was a really strict regime, but there was almost that element of lawlessness as well, which sort of is quite like sort of conflicting to what you would think it would be like.
Well, I think any amount of experience in any time in history teaches you a number of things about the law. Firstly, you assume that it's impartial, and you assume that it's some kind of science, and that if you behave and you go along and you do the right thing, then things will work out for you. And of course, that's not true. You can be had up and unjustly or unjustly. The law gets it wrong quite a lot of times. The other thing is you assume that criminals would be quite easy to catch and put away, and in actual fact, they're not. Whether they're committing crimes like drug smuggling or money laundering, whatever it is, and again, even with our political class, and we had what's his name, Zahawi, who was busy fiddling his taxes, and if he'd been a normal person, he'd have gone to prison. The fact that he wasn't, it means he gets a slap on the wrist, and that's the end of it. So there is this double standard that applies right across history. And it's the same in Nazi Germany. There are these guys who are gangsters, and they're tolerated by the regime, and they're sufficiently powerful that nobody dare cross them. And they can carry on making money out of criminality, in much the same way that gangsters have throughout history.
Yeah. I guess it's like, I mean, we've touched on it a few times, haven't we? There's it sort of goes around, doesn't it? That sort of, we're no further forward in that sort of thing with gangs, criminal gangs now than then. It's no different. It's just different for different things.
I met a guy in an Italian book festival, American writer. He was there talking about something else, but he knew the gangster lawyer who worked for one of the senior kind of gangster organizations in America. And he said, one thing you have to understand about this guy, he was also the same guy that taught Trump everything he knew about business. He worked for Trump eventually, and taught him how you operate as a gangster and applied that to business, and that's why Trump behaved the way he did. And of course now he's a convicted felon and he's president of America. So the sky's the limit for gangsters. Whether they start small or they decide to play politics. Putin's another one. He started when Russia went pear-shaped. He managed to sort of make good use of his criminal contacts whilst he was mayor of St. Petersburg, and then became the biggest gangster of the lot.
Well, that's the thing, isn't it? Is that in the book as well, there's that sort of the levels, isn't there, of gangsters? You've got your low level sort of wannabe gangsters, but then you've got your rich and sort of the sort of heads of the business, the heads of the gangs leading that. And the thing is, it's like almost like the gang leaders got that sort of very much the power, but then actually they do very little. They get everybody else to do that. What's that minion thing, isn't it? Of getting everybody else to do your dirty work for you. Absolutely.
And they're working, they're living under a gangster regime. I mean, that's exactly what the Nazis were. So, it's top to bottom in German society, that level of that sort of ambience of criminality.
How long, when you write one of the Schenke books, how long does the sort of research and that sort of process from start to finish take?
It's difficult to say. I mean, the research probably takes up most of the time because it's just fascinating. So whatever I'm writing, the research takes up most of the time. And it only stops because I get a call from my editor who will say, Simon, that book you're handing in 2 months, how's it going? And that's usually the cue to get started. And then many sleepless nights and cups of coffee later, the book's done. So it takes about 2 to 3 months really to write the book, and then a little bit more or less, maybe, depending on the book, to do the research. Because I tend to work quite quickly because, deadlines are deadlines.
And I imagine because you've got that sort of historical sort of interest, and so the rabbit holes are humongous that you go down.
Oh, Warren-like. Absolutely. Well, as I said, you think you're researching one book and you ultimately find yourself with about 4 or 5 plots that you could write about, or you come across something and think, okay, well, that could be a plot later on. So the research, it just kind of explodes the possibilities for the stories that you might tell that you're doing, and then you have to kind of rein it all into the right one in front of you. Then get back into it, and that's of course where all the exciting reading is.
So do you have like lots of post-it ideas of going like when you're going to the next one, sort of thing? Oh, that would make a really good book for next time.
Well, I don't post it. I mean, as I said, I write in the margins, and then I will write up the notes from. So, for example, in this book, you can see I've been busy marking down the side there. So all of this stuff will get sort of condensed into my notebooks, and I have a big pile of notebooks on my bookshelf, under various subjects and all the rest of it. So you've got it all there. But when I'm writing, I don't reference them because I think it's important to get the story down as quickly as you can, because it has a kind of pace and energy of its own. And then if you need to check facts, I may put something in brackets, check the date of this or whatever, and then come back and do that during the edits. So loads and loads and loads of notebooks, basically.
Yeah, lots and lots of ideas. Do you read outside of non-fiction? Do you read fiction, sort of, which isn't historically, or is there anything you sort of read that's not
Yeah, I read a lot of fiction. The only rule I have on that is I don't read fiction that kind of overlaps with the fiction I'm writing.
Yeah.
Because I don't want to pick up any kind of tics or anything like that. The only exception to that at the moment is a friend of mine recommended I think it's John McDowell books, Travis McGee. I don't know if you come across this character.
No, I haven't.
Well, when you're reading it, I mean, he said, "Oh, yeah, you can see where Lee Child gets it all from. It's this writer. He wrote. I mean, I didn't realize this. He wrote the novel on which Cape Fear was based. So
Oh, really?
very good pedigree. But I'm reading this stuff and I'm thinking, this guy is fantastic. So in the last month or so, I think I've read 6 of those novels
Well,
because they're just so good. I mean, it's not just that they're good crime stories; they're really, really well written, and the characterization is just amazing. And so when you kind of come across something like that, you can't stop yourself really.
no. Well, that's good. That's what you want. That's like, that's the dream, isn't it? To find an author that you haven't read before, and then discover the back catalogue of everything they've written. Is there's nothing more rewarding than that for readers, I think.
Oh, for sure.
Just before we go, I'm just looking at the time, coming up to 8 o'clock. What's next for you, Simon? I know you've got a couple more book events coming up, and what's sort of coming up with you writing wise?
Well, yeah, I've got 3 more events to do in East Anglia. So that's festivals and so on, and 1 or 2 more interviews. I think I've just about finished writing articles. So then it's back home to Mauritius and carry on with the next Roman book. I'm about a quarter of the way through. And then at the same time, I've been reading up on the Nazi mind and doing some research there. So that the German book that will follow, the Schenke book that will follow the Roman book, will deal with the Hitler Youth, because there was this huge youth crime issue in Nazi Germany that went completely out of control when the war started. So that will be the topic of the next book. So yeah, busy days.
Yeah, no, definitely. No, I think it's yeah, I mean, I think the sort of your research, I mean, it sounds like your research is a full-time job without writing. Was it 2.5 books a year as well?
Yeah, well, yeah, half of a book, I say 2.5 because I co-write with Tim Andrews. We do sort of limited series on the side. Great guy to work with. So it's very different, co-writing a book to writing it by yourself. I like it, but I wouldn't want to do it full time. It's just nice to sort of, I write a bit, send it over to him. He sort of changes a bit, adds a bit more onto it. We discuss it, and it moves on. And if you're working with someone who you kind of gel with, it's amazing where how you can kind of come up with things that you hadn't thought of before. And they will suggest something, then you'll counter suggest something, and you both of you will end up in a quite surprising yourself, and it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated. I've spoken to a couple of sort of husband and wife sort of writing teams, and I always find it fascinating that one, they don't sort of kill each other, and two, that that's sort of like you said, that bouncing off each other and having. But I think you have to have that sort of relationship, don't you? That you can take that sort of, well, I don't like that. Maybe we could do it this way. Yeah, I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, but I mean, I would imagine get it wrong, and that's dynamite for that relationship.
Yeah, well, yeah, no tea. Or in the spare room for the night if they kill off one of your favourite characters.
Yes, it's quite a shock. You've done what? You've killed the hero? Yeah, bloodbath at the house. Yeah.
Oh, well, yeah. Oh, I mean, the sort of final question I was going to ask was because you write across so many different sort of historical periods, do you have to be quite strict when you're sort of and obviously you don't want they're not going to get muddled up, but that you sort of write one at a time, or can you sort of do both?
Yeah, I mean, because you're writing 2 different periods, and I'm not a female, so I can't multitask. So I'm pretty good at doing one, then the next. But that said, there were a couple of times where I was without thinking, somebody says something in a particular voice, and so I've had macro appear in the first draft of one of the Schenke novels, and I think Leibniz turned up in Rome at one stage. So So, but for thank goodness we don't have to publish the first draft we write.
No. Well, it's an occupational hazard, I guess, especially crossing the hundreds and thousands of years that you could end up in trouble there.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this evening. It's been an absolute delight to chat to you about about A Death in Berlin, which I will get here out in front of my notes, which is out now in hardback. And this is the third in the series. So if you haven't checked out, you can read it as a standalone. It's absolutely fine to read as a standalone. But if you want to read the others as well, there's two more before this one. What are they called, Simon?
So it's Blackout was the first one, and then Dead of Night was the second one. So that's all about child murderers. And then the third one, obviously, Dead of Night.
This one.
But they all stand alone. That's how you have to write it. So, but like any series, though, I think if you kind of buy in early, then it's fun watching the characters develop and see these various strands appear in each.
Definitely.
Yeah, there's always Easter egg moments like that.
Yeah, no, well, I really enjoyed it, and and it's been a pleasure to chat to you this evening. Thank you everybody for joining us. Thank you, Simon. Good luck with the rest of the tour, and have a safe trip home.
Thank you. Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
So, how do I get out?
Oh, just literally.